Hi, today I want to show you a few tips for editing your pinhole photography images. Now, these tips will work really for any kind of image, but obviously the point of this particular exercise is to spiff these pinhole projects up so that they look as sharp as possible. First of all, I'm going to suggest that you use Lightroom, and I'm sure a number of you have this. If you have any interest whatsoever in photography, I very highly recommend this program. This is Lightroom version 5, and I believe you can get it at a student discount for $80. It's a very powerful program, and it'll do probably, I don't know, 95% of what you need for most images. There is definitely use for Photoshop, and I'll include a little few tutorials for that. If you're interested in Photoshop, you can actually get Photoshop only as a Creative Cloud membership now, and I think that for students you can get it for just the Photoshop and Lightroom for like $9 a month, or excuse me, $9.99 a month, or you can get the full Adobe suite, which includes Illustrator, Premiere Pro, lots of different things that might be useful for you. And that's $19.99 a month, I think, for the student discount. Anyways, Adobe.com is where you want to go for that. If you don't have it, you can download Lightroom and Photoshop for a 30-day trial. But of course, there's lots of computers on campus that have Lightroom and Photoshop, and specifically the Mac Lab would be a place to look for that. So here we go. I've got the program open, and the first thing we're going to do is import some images. So you want to go File, Import Photo and Video, or you can click on this little button down here that says Import, and a second little window opens up. Now from here you need to find where your pictures are, and for the sake of this demo I put them on the desktop, so it'll take me a little while to scroll there, but you can see it's just a matter of making the little windows come down. And for this particular one, I'm going to actually choose multiple images, and what you can see is you can choose a specific folder, but you can also if you take the parent directory, you'll get everything that's inside of it. So I don't care about that one, so I'm going to uncheck it. You can see some of these are clearly not related, so I'm just going to go ahead and uncheck that. I'm going to probably stick with that. Those are just pinhole images right there. One of the useful things that you can do is add some keywords, and the keywords are going to allow you to search for these things later on. And so, okay, now we're going to have 3 images in the library, so no big deal, we're not going to have to search for that. But to give you an idea, my main catalog has something like 130,000 images in it, and it's really easy for me to find images, assuming that I did a good job keywording, just based on what the content is. And for example, like here, this is a picture of my dog Maybe. I couldn't begin to tell you how many thousands of pictures of my own dogs. I can search for the keyword Maybe, and then I can find all of these images. Definitely useful. Metadata I'm not going to really go into now, but one of the important things that you should consider is adding your name and contact information to the metadata. And of course, if you pull this down, you can just do edit presets, and then this is a sticky setting, so every time from now on it'll show that. Develop settings we're going to skip for this point, so we're just going to go ahead and click import. And you can see it's all pretty quick. Now, one of the things that is actually really nice about this is it can read raw files, and we can talk about raw files later on in a different project. But basically, a JPEG has camera settings kind of baked into it, and so you're stuck with things like the camera sharpening and contrast and saturation, not to mention exposure latitude, whereas with a raw file you can change those things after the fly. definitely something that you can consider. And if you have Lightroom and a camera, I suggest that you would want to go ahead and use the raw settings as much as possible. But either way, what we're talking about today is going to be alright for JPEG images as well. So, okay, you can see I have 3 images, and actually there's just 2 that I'm using. This one here is actually an edit of that one, obviously, so you can see, you know, how it would be improved. First one here, you can see a little dog picture. There are a few things that you're going to want to try. So first of all, when you import it, it's going to be in the library module. Next, you want to go to develop module. And if you click, you can see that the cursor is a little magnifying glass. If you click on it, it goes into 100% view. Click on it again, it comes small. And that changes depending on what particular window you have open, but it's a good, useful tool to know. Now, what you can see here, all these little dots, that's what you call digital noise. We can get rid of that a little bit. If you come down here to the detail palette, excuse me, there's 2 different kinds. So if it's gray, then it's luminance. If it's got red, green, and blue, then it's color. And we can actually see a little bit of each in there. I think most of this is luminance noise. There's a little bit of color. So basically what we want to do is we want to move these sliders over just a little bit at a time until it smooths out. And you really want to do this at 100% view, at least initially, so you can get an idea how that's going to look. Now click on it again and zoom out. Now this will affect the overall sharpness of an image, and you can turn this toggle on and off and see, and it didn't actually, I think, make it any worse. Sharpening, this is a very useful tool. However, it's not useful for a pinhole photograph, really. We want something that has a little bit crisper edges. Next, we're going to come up here to the basic tab, and if you think the coloring is off a little bit, there are different things you can do. So here, this pull down menu, you can change it to auto or custom if it's a JPEG. If you have a raw file, then you can change it to different lighting sources like tungsten or fluorescent, or it can be daylight or cloudy or shade. But because this is a JPEG file, we only have these 3 options. We're going to leave it a shot to begin with. We can change these temperature sliders, and this is going to change things, make it either more yellow or more blue, and obviously the slider shows that. We're going to make it just a little warmer, and then the tint changes it either to the magenta or the green. And you can use these in combination to really balance out the overall exposure. The other thing that you can use is this white balance selector, and if you find something that should be white or gray or black in an image, you can click on it. And so I'm going to assume this is supposed to be black. And you know, I think that this is not too bad. I think maybe it added a little bit of a magenta hue. And what you can see in this histogram here is that it starts to separate out the different color channels a little bit. So that's maybe not the best choice overall here. If I go back a couple steps in the history palette, you can see it all matches up pretty well. So I think the image is actually pretty neutral to begin with, but this is a very useful tool to use. When you're done with it, you can click done. And it's important to know that the setting is probably not that you can click in multiple places at once. That's something they have to change by default. You usually click once and then it goes back to where it is, and then you have to click it again and bring it out. The last thing I wanted to say here is that if you look at the histogram, usually what you want to see is these peaks spread out over the entire histogram block. This is showing me that it's pretty well underexposed. And if you can do different things. You can click and you can drag right inside the window, and I don't know how well it's showing up in the video, but there's different sections that kind of lighten up, that's showing you what area you're going to be affecting if you pull on it. So there's that way, and then you can use these basic sliders. You can just go ahead and pull it up. And you don't want to go too far. It depends on the image. Generally speaking, you want these things spread out over the whole histogram. However, not every histogram should be spread out over the whole. Not every peak should be spread out over the whole histogram. It just depends on the image. I think this is pretty appropriate here. We can definitely see that this looks like a dog face here with something over the head. So we move that up. We're going to want probably just to contrast a little bit. we're going to want to go ahead and tweak these different settings as it feels appropriate, and just do this by eye. What we want to avoid is if these little triangles light up, that means we're clipping information, and I'm just going to go ahead and show you. I'm just going to go ahead and pull this all the way over, and that actually doesn't do it. There we go. Now we have some clipping, and you can see if you hold your cursor over it, you get that red overlay. That means you've gone too far, and so you want to bring these values just back until you're not getting that. I actually liked where we were before, so I'm going to go ahead and bring it back to that level over here using the history palette. The next thing I want you to look at is clarity. Now this is the one where you're really going to see a big difference. Now what clarity does is it looks at pixel edges, and it individually will try to increase contrast on a pixel to pixel level. Now you don't really need to understand the algorithms to know that, but clarity basically you can think of as a haze remover, and it's a really nice tool for the pinholes especially. Now you can see it makes the shapes a little sharper, and depending on the image it's going to work better or worse for you. Vibrance is a saturation tool. Saturation is going to increase obviously the saturation for all colors or decreased equally, and you can see how that works for this particular image. I'll go ahead and bring this back to 0. Vibrance, what it does is it's basically, you can think of as a smart saturation. It's going to look at the colors, and as you move it up to increased saturation, it's going to say, okay, blue is relatively unsaturated here, so I'm gonna add extra saturation to blue, but maybe the yellows are already perfectly saturated, so I'm not going to add so much saturation there. Really, this is a smart saturation tool, and where you're really going to notice a big difference is landscapes, I think, to some extent, because you can pretty quickly get things to kind of being overdone with saturation, but where you really see it is with portraits, and the vibrance tool is going to protect the skin tones in a way that saturation won't. And so for a basic Caucasian skin tone, for example, if you move your saturation all the way up to 100, what you would find is that the skin tone gets really kind of orangey, and it looks almost like somebody put a fake tan spray on. But if you click the vibrance all the way up, then yeah, it might start to look a little fake, but it's going to look much closer to normal. And really, these settings, any of these settings, you probably don't want to go much above about 50 anyways. And so if you crank up the vibrance to 50 on a portrait, you're probably going to look pretty good. Now these are definitely subjective. These are definitely things that you want to decide based on every image, not just go ahead and say every image needs X or Y or whatever, but definitely something to keep in mind. Now that said, clarity for a pinhole you probably want to crank all the way up, and pinhole photography is probably going to be the exception there. So this image here a little bit blurrier than it could be. This here is going to be a better example of these tools. Now what we can see here is the histogram is spread out pretty well. I think we can actually increase it just a little bit more. And so again, we can do the exposure, we can do the contrast, and see how it's spreading the histogram out. It's making the darks, the shadows darker, it's making the whites brighter. And you can see how just changing the contrast actually gives an increase in apparent sharpness. So we can do the contrast settings, or we can do that manually. We can change the exposure up, and then we can lower the blacks, and we can get kind of a custom effect. And generally speaking, if you can customize things and do things individually rather than as a one big setting, you're going to have better result. So just going ahead and increasing the contrast that way makes this much sharper. Again, clarity is going to even do more for that. Now what we can see is that there's actually a pretty decent amount of noise, and when we do things like crank the clarity all the way up, it just gets much more apparent. So you can see there's that version. Again, we're going to want to come down to the detail tab, and I think that this is again a mix of luminance and color noise, and so we're just going to go ahead and bring this up a little bit at a time and try to find the right balance. So somewhere in there. For color, luminance, we need to go a little stronger. Oops, I went the wrong way by mistake. And you know, that's pretty decent. Smooth it out. Color and luminance noise, some people kind of compare it to grain in film. I don't think that's exactly a fair comparison, but it definitely gives you the same idea. Now this one here actually has some decent lines here, so it might benefit from sharpening. And if that's the case, detail you always want to have down at 0, but you got to change the sharpening first. Detail for this kind of setting where you have a noisy image is always going to make things look even noisier. But if you go ahead and crank this all the way up, you want to look at this zoomed in, and then again turn it on and off and see. So I think we're making improvements there. The radius is going to basically change the radius of the pixels where it's like looking for the contrast. And if you hold on the Alt key while you click on this, and you can kind of see an embossed overlay. And definitely look up here. You're only going to see it in certain areas where the highest levels of contrast are, basically. And you want it to be so, you know, you definitely see some areas there. Masking is the next thing you want to do, and holding down the Alt key will allow you to see this black and white overlay. And basically what you want to do is you want to move it over till you get the main lines starting to be white. White's going to be where it's showing it. And you want things like sky and background not to be, you want it to be black basically, because you don't want to apply the sharpening to areas where you don't need it. So there we go. We're looking pretty good here. We're going to come back up. Now we're going to add a little vibrance to it. That's just going to be, again, a little saturation. This one I think can also benefit from a little just regular saturation. You can see we're starting to get some green yellows here, and that's probably pretty natural for the winter grass. Now the last thing I want to show you here in Lightroom is that pinhole lenses are going to show you spots on the digital sensor. It has a filter in front of it. If there's any dust on there at all, it's going to show that. And so that's going to come and show like little spots like this. Here's another little one. There's a really nice tool for getting rid of those, and it is the cloning spot removal. And so depending on whether you have it on heal or clone is going to either clone is going to be a 1-for-1 pixel copy. So if like I clicked here and clicked there, it would just basically copy this umbrella into that spot. Whereas heal, it's going to try to blend the two, and usually, not always, it's going to give you a better result. So I like to keep it on heal at least to begin with. So once that's open, then if you click on it, it's going to try to make that edit. So if you want to go zooming in again, which of course you do, then hold on the space bar, and then you get the magnet, you click on it, and then you can do your edit. Now this happens to be the right size for that particular dot. If it's not, you can of course change the slider here, and you can see how that works. Feathering is always a good idea, and you can see there's actually, I'll make this a little bigger so it's more obvious. What you can see is that the inner one and the outer one, the distance between the two is the amount of the feather. And the more you feather, generally speaking, the better result you're going to have. Opacity is going to be, you know, percentage of coverage. Generally speaking, you want that to be on high. So we're going to bring this back down to the appropriate size for that dot. You want it to be just bigger, and then you can go ahead and you can click on it, and then you can see it's going to add a second circle. And overall, I think this is a good edit, so we're going to be happy with that. Now again, hold on the space bar and you can click and drag around in the image. Here's another one. We're going to go ahead, same thing, click and drag, and you can see that's a pretty good edit. Now the other thing that works pretty well is if you, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off for a moment, make it smaller, kind of look around. So here's a spot that we're definitely going to want to work on, but I'll show you this. We turn this back on. Down here it says visualize spots. It's going to give you a black and white overlay, and so when this little slider is all the way over, it's not going to be very useful. And again, it depends on the image, but if you start to bring it down, then you can start to see where spots might turn out. And again, this is more let's say complicated because it's a pinhole photograph. If you had a regular glass optics on there, this would be very, very obvious. And so we're just going to go ahead, we're going to make this a little bigger. You can use the square bracket keys to change your pixel size. And there was one down here I saw. I'm going to make that just a little brighter. And you can kind of get a feel for what's a spot and what's not just based on the shape of it. So these are pretty clear circles. And you can go ahead and you can click and you can make these edits right here within the visualize spots overlay window. You want to turn it off when you're done and then kind of take a look and see how it turned out. There's one spot here I think I'm gonna change right here on this table, and then we're gonna go ahead and call that done. So overall here, this is the after. We're gonna come back down. This is the before, and you can see that makes a pretty good difference in the overall image quality of your pinhole lens. Next thing what we're going to do is we're going to bring it over to Photoshop, and I'm going to show you one more trick for making things look a little bit sharper. Now the easiest thing here is probably right click and do edit in, so you don't have to remember any keyboard shortcuts. Now you can do edit in Photoshop directly. What I want to recommend you do, well, for this one let's just do edit in Photoshop, and we're going to edit the original. But we want to actually do it with the Lightroom adjustments, because if we do it as the original, it's going to show it as the before, whereas everything we did here is going to, if we do it with the adjustments, will come on through to Photoshop. If you have the program open, it will just take a moment to open up here. Now from this point, what I'm going to do is now that it's open, I can see there's actually another dot, and so I'm going to fix that. If you do Control-Alt-0 on the keyboard, then you can zoom in. Over here we have the spot healing brush tool. That's the one you're going to want to use a lot of the time. It's pretty easy to use. Again, use the square brackets to make it bigger, and if you just click on it, it'll take care of your issues. Now you probably can't see it very well here, but what happened is we're kind of losing a little bit of the textural detail, and so when that happens, you might be better off with a spot healing brush instead. So instead of just clicking on something here, now we need to select a source that we're sampling from. So we hold down the Alt key, and you can see it turns into a little target. So we're going to sample from here, and then now if we click and just kind of paint with the cursor, it actually gives a much nicer result. Click, and that's pretty good. So now I told you Control-Alt-0 zooms into 100%. Just Control-0 fills the frame, and so that looks pretty good. Next step I want to do here is copy this background layer. So I'm going to click and I'm going to drag it down to this new copy layer, and if you just hold down your mouse over it, it'll eventually show you a little indicator to say what that is. Basically these are two identical layers now. What we're going to do is filter, we're going to do other, we're going to do high pass, and this is going to give us like this almost embossed sort of look. What you're going to want to do is change your radius and kind of play with it. Once you start to see colors in here, that's too far. If you don't see colors, then it's probably pretty good. But we want to be able to see some contrast between them, so there's still a little bit of color here in the red, so I'm going to bring this down just a little bit more. You want it to be fairly subtle, but you definitely want to be able to pick out some of the detail of your image. So we're going to say OK. And you think, wow, that doesn't really help. But what we do next is go to the blending modes. So here we have normal. We want to go ahead and change it to either overlay or soft light. And what we see now is if we turn this on or off, we get just that little bit of extra sharpness, and that helps out, I think, pretty well for this particular image. Overlay here is going to give you a little bit stronger, and soft light a little bit more subtle. And generally speaking, subtle edits are going to be a little better than more heavy-handed. So there we go. We're in pretty good shape here. The last thing we're going to do here is save it for the web. So we're going to do File, we're going to do Save for Web, And this was a pretty big file to begin with, so this was straight out of the camera, almost 5200 pixels. We don't need it anywhere near that big. Somewhere in the, let's say 1200 pixels will be more than adequate for the class. So type that in and then hit enter, return on the keyboard, and it'll make it much smaller. And we're going to, here we go, click save. And we'll just put it on the desktop. Now before I do that here, I want to show you, this is set here for JPEG. This is a sticky setting. It might be one of these other settings here, the GIF or the PNG file, depending on the computer you use. For this assignment, just go ahead and keep it as JPEG or change it to JPEG, and where it says very high, just go ahead and make that high. And so that's going to be a little bit smaller file size. And if you look down here in this corner, you can see how the file size changes with these different settings. So I'm going to make it maximum, and you can see that that's over twice the size, actually 3 times. If you put it on low, you can see that it's way less. And you can also see how that changes the image quality here. So look at it low compared to high compared to maximum, and you can see there's a big difference at the extremes, but the middle one's usually pretty good for your settings. Now high, we're going to say that's okay. What you don't want to do is save this over the exact original file. You want to give this a new name, and we're going to just say low res edit. Now the last thing I want you to do is here the img underscore 0076. That's the file name the camera gave it. I don't want that. I want you to put your name there. So I'm just going to do my first initial and then my last name. And this is how I want you to include all of your file names for your class here. That way, it's really easy for me to understand who submitted what. Go ahead and do save, and then we can close this. We're not going to save it here. If you did, then I would suggest save it as a Photoshop file, and it would automatically prompt that because there's 2 layers. And but we don't need to do that because that was a pretty easy edit, and there's no need to waste the extra space. So there you go. Here's the final version of it. We can look at it as a preview, and that's not too bad. That's fairly sharp for a pinhole photograph. You definitely know where that is taken. You have some good detail, but still it's not super crisp and super sharp like it would be if it was glass optics that you used. Let me know if you have any questions. I know I showed you a whole lot of tricks here. You're going to want to have to play with Lightroom and Photoshop in order to really start to understand what I'm talking about. However, I think that especially Lightroom is going to be such a good use of your time. Even for editing your cell phone images, it makes such a huge improvement in your overall image quality, and it's such a great way to organize your images that I think Lightroom is a very good investment for anybody who has even just the slightest interest in photography. It's a great program, and hopefully you'll get comfortable using it this semester. Again, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll leave it there.